Hello, and welcome to another Hoeg Postmortem analysis, this time of Sony and Naughty Dog's The Last of Us Part 2. Now, if you haven't watched us do a postmortem before, you should know eventually this video will be spoiler-filled, but not at the outset. If you haven't played the game yet, you can watch with us until, if you're watching on YouTube, that little bar shows a chapter that moves into spoiler territory. I will also audioly give that warning in this space, but before then, we have a lot to talk about. The Last of Us Part 2 is the sequel to the critically acclaimed and much beloved by me, originally The Last of Us Part 1, whatever it might otherwise be called after this part came out. And that game is one of the best of the PlayStation 3 era, one of my favorite kind of cinematic action-adventure games. I really enjoyed the entirety of that one, and so I was very excited about this project. This was announced 5 some odd years ago, and I was very excited about diving in to what this Part 2 would be. Because, and here are spoilers for the original, now 7 years old, the ending of the original Last of Us was both picture perfect and very, very controversial. Because at the end of that game, your character, the character that you've been playing the entire time, makes a choice. Ellie, immune from the infection that has wiped out all of humanity, has been presented to the Fireflies at a hospital in Salt Lake City, and Joel, the main character, the character that you play as in that game, has been confronted with the fact that as he delivers Ellie, if they want to make a vaccine from her blood, from her body, they are going to have to kill her to do so. And at that point in time, the game forces you, as Joel, to basically kill everybody in the facility and to save Ellie for yourself, for your past, for your history with losing a daughter at the start of the outbreak of the infection, all of this stuff that nicely comes together in that moment, even though, and I remember this from back then, as a player, you may disagree with what the game is forcing you to do. You can't move on if you don't execute everybody in that hospital as Joel. And it's that starts as the jumping off point for The Last of Us Part 2. The very first thing that you see in this game is Joel talking to Tommy, his brother, in Jackson, Wyoming, about the events of the last game. And I have to say, I really thought that the opening was very strong. I thought that the first couple of hours of the video game were absolutely fantastic. I was thrilled to be playing it. And in all honesty, when I saw some of the reviews over this past week talk about how not fun the experience was, how visceral it was, I was worried about it. And those fears were allayed for the first couple hours of the game. Now, in terms of actual gameplay, this game, Last of Us Part 2, pretty much flows almost exactly from The Last of Us Part 1. Has the very similar stealth mechanics, has very similar crafting mechanics, has very similar weapon usage, and all these various other things. They added a jump button, they added a prone button, which we will get to in just a second. But overall, it's mostly the same game, just gussied up with 7 years of advanced video game technology. And when I say gussied up, there has never been a game this detailed. There's never been a game this pretty. It is absolutely crazy to see all of this prettiness put forth before you. And it's in that spirit that you just stop and look at everything. And to some extent, when you're running through something really fast on a horse or in a car or whatever it might be, you can't help but marvel at how much effort has been put into all of your surroundings that you might see for a second and you might not see at all if your camera is pointed the opposite direction. It is just absolutely crazy, and it is clearly where all the resources went. The graphics and the detail and the art, and it is utterly fantastic for all those things. So if you just love the aesthetics of The Last of Us, if you just love the screenshots that you have seen, I can't not recommend putting this in your PlayStation 4, trying it out for yourself, because virtually every new scene is a startlingly gorgeous vista, is a fantastic looking smoke effect, is water coming off of roofs, all kind of looking differently throughout a torrential rainstorm. And it does make for an exciting, visceral experience. Being able to walk into every new area and see something new is its own kind of joy. And I do think that's one of the reasons why The Last of Us Part 2 got the reviews that you see it getting this past week. 9s and 10s. I think the Metacritic has it as something like a 95. And that's part of what we're going to have to discuss here. Because while I say the graphics are great, while I say that there are things that Naughty Dog does well here, I think they're very good at small talk. They're very good at the character interactions that don't have anything to do with the plot or the overall motivations of the character, but just kind of tell little bits of background or little story beats, or where they snark at each other like they're tweeting different tweets at each other while they ride on horseback. I think they are very good at that. There's a very naturalistic way that Naughty Dog has been able for the past 10 years or so to depict their characters, to develop those characterizations in that space. They are very good at that. But what they are not very good at least as of The Last of Us Part 2, is overall narrative structure, overall plot, overall character motivation. And one of the things that I wound up saying as I finished this last night, and I put this in a tweet last night at some untold hour of the morning when the credits finally rolled on this game, is that I had a good time with it. But narratively, the story is ludicrous, the character motivations are bipolar, and the pacing is atrocious. So without getting into spoilers yet, if you just want the short form, you don't want to listen to the rest of this video, you don't want to watch, that's absolutely fine. That's my overall thought process on this game, is that you had all of this art, you had all of this effort, you had all of these resources in the service of practically nothing. When you think of something like fine art, when you think of something like Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, whatever it is that might be fine art to you, and you think about the things that motivated that art, some bit of beauty that they found in the environment, the Sistine Chapel devoted to God, whatever your religion might be, and then you think, okay, we've got that kind of art potential, we've got those kinds of artists, these kinds of resources necessary to do something like that, and we're going to put it in service to our favorite reality TV show conundrum, or our favorite Sesame Street lesson. That is the kind of feeling that you get with The Last of Us Part 2. And worse, from my perspective, this is actually one of my pet peeves, they do very simplistic things. They tell very simplistic messages that maybe could have been conveyed to you on Sesame Street, if not maybe a CW show, The 100, whatever it might be, and they convey them to you like they are giving you a profound bolt of lightning with all of the kind of edifice and Sundance Film Festival-ness that might accompany such a profound revelation. But virtually everything that they want to talk about here, you have seen talked about in other media, and probably better, certainly more succinctly. Because The Last of Us Part 2 runs 25 plus hours and delivers a message that you could have seen in Death Wish, or that you could have seen in virtually every television show in the era of peak TV where there is a revenge plot associated with it. Maybe an episode of The Walking Dead that you liked. And we're going to talk about how this winds up feeling a little bit like a bad season of The Walking Dead in a minute. But before we get there, I do want to comment a little bit on the gameplay. This is another part of that kind of 95 Metacritic concept that I don't fully understand. When you read those reviews, you get this notion that the gameplay is largely the same as the original, which it is. And that's fine. I enjoyed the original. It's a little bit sad to see it not evolve more than it did over the course of an entire generation of a video game console, but it's good. It's fine. But what it isn't is profound. It isn't new. It isn't evolved. And you can really kind of get into this. I talked earlier about her having a prone position in this video game, and she does. You can lay on the ground. One of the things that happens when you lay on the ground is that you can shoot from the ground without popping up. And in my view, it makes the mechanic almost completely broken, because you can essentially go prone in tall grass, you can go prone in various spots where they can't quite see you, you can shoot from there without exposing your position. Sometimes they will react to that shot, and then you wind up getting into the same situation that every video gamer who has played a stealth game in the past 2 decades has gotten into, where the first person comes around the corner, you grab them, you kill them, the next person comes, you do the same, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. And so when we talk about gameplay, it actually isn't that involving. And one of the things that Naughty Dog has done here is they have built these kind of giant arenas. So let's just say, as a hypothetical, again, we're still in the spoiler-free zone, you walk into an area and it has 2 stores on the left, it has a big space on the right, maybe it has something that you can jump down, maybe an elevated area in the 2 corners. You have these giant arenas that are clearly built for you to potentially explore with, fight around, and ultimately what you can do is you can enter this space, find something to kneel behind or some tall grass to go prone in, and you fight everybody in front of you. And that happens in every single encounter. That happens throughout the game, and they don't really do anything to stop that. Later in the game, certain protections are given to certain enemies to try to dissuade you from going for some of these simple kind of maneuvers, but they never quite work. And so you get into these big areas, you have your encounter, and then because of the way the economy works, because you are still crafting and need to make sure your bullets are in reserve and everything else, you wind up having to run around these whole areas and open drawers and do all these things. Now, I enjoy that because I'm an explorer-type video gamer, and I like walking through all these stuff. I like looking at all these details. I like opening those drawers. But for somebody who isn't into that, for somebody who just wants a pretty straightforward action-adventure game, it's got to be cripplingly boring because you wind up having 5 minutes of fighting and then 15 minutes of walking around and opening things and picking things up. Now, I suspect you don't have to do all of that because I think the game is probably good enough to make sure that it gives you bullets in the next area, to give you some fighting chance. But that's the overall problem with the gameplay, and it's not one that I saw discussed. And I think the reason I didn't see it discussed is because everybody is really enamored or at least interested in the narrative that Naughty Dog wanted to tell, which means that these video game reviews are kind of straddling a line. And this is one of those things that I would ask reviewers is, what are you reviewing? Are you reviewing that this game looks great, that it really doesn't have frame rate hitches? There is an issue with the dodge move. Sometimes it causes a frame rate hitch, but that's really the only issue in the whole game that I noticed personally. That it functions, it has responsive gameplay, and it looks great, because that's a kind of Consumer Reports type review. Hey, it looks great. It does what it says on the tin. You want to go on an Ellie revenge quest, you can absolutely do that. But it doesn't talk about the narrative then. And for a game like this, for a studio like Naughty Dog that clearly aspires to be what amounts to movie makers in the video game space, I think you really have to evaluate whether or not they were effective at driving you forward. Because this game has some good gameplay. Like Bungie used to say, it has a good loop. It has good 30 seconds of fun. Every interaction you have is kind of entertaining. You've got a lot of tools at your disposal. You get to look at the pretty stuff as it happens. But in the service of almost nothing. And worse, in the service of things that don't make sense and are clearly the writers moving people around in the way that they want to be moved around because they need to get X point across. And even while it looks that artificial, even while it rings wrongly to somebody like me, and I would suspect somebody like you, if you were watching this video, they still go back and say, hey, even if that is artificial, isn't it profound? And no, it frankly isn't. And my hope would be that when we start reviewing video games as narratives, when a company like Naughty Dog wants to go forward with something that says, we are going to tell this important story, we are going to do it, and it is going to be something that moves you or that really tells you something about humanity, like the best novels or the best movies, then we need to evaluate them on that basis. And I either don't think that video game reviewers necessarily have the tool set for that, and I don't really want to ascribe that to them, or they just don't have the inclination. For the most part, the role of reviewing a video game hasn't been to evaluate narrative arcs, hasn't been to evaluate character motivations in the way a good TV reviewer or a good movie reviewer might. It has been to evaluate gameplay. You don't go in and review Super Mario Odyssey on the basis of, well, you know, Mario's motivation to retrieve Princess Peach from Bowser on their wedding day, I really didn't feel the angst that I should have felt in The Little Plumber. No. That has not been historically the job of a video game reviewer, and yet we ask these outlets to do both that review, talk about jumping on blocks and how that feels, and this review, which is, hey, the gameplay is basically the same, but the story is attempting to be profound. Hours and hours of cutscenes, ridiculous motion capture, all this dialogue, all this money, and unfortunately, it just doesn't go anywhere. So I enjoyed my time with The Last of Us Part 2. I wouldn't say I didn't like it, but overall, it was a really meandering plot that didn't go anywhere, thought it was telling you something really important, and at the end of the day, really didn't. And I think that's about what I can say without diving into spoilers. So if you haven't played the game, if you were just checking out the opening end of this video, thank you so much for dropping by. You can tell people that we're here and that we are doing spoiler-free stuff at the front end of these videos. For everybody else, we're going to give them a beat to leave, and then we're going to dive in to a whole lot of specifics. All right, is everybody else still here? Then let's dive in. So if you have played the game, then you know this. If you haven't played the game or you have otherwise just spoiled yourself, you also know this. But the big trick of The Last of Us Part 2 is that you play for half the game as Ellie and half the game as a new character named Abby. And the start of the game is premised around Joel getting murdered by Abby in a very grotesque fashion, in a fashion that is designed for you, the player, to react viscerally to. That Abby and her crew are so negative, are so animalistic in their hatred of Joel, that I believe the game wants you to hop on the Ellie trolley, to be completely behind her as she leaves on her vengeance quest to go and to hit Seattle. One of the problems I have with the entirety of that premise is that it has long been a discussion point, a topic, a very good piece of drama, if we're being honest, for folks to discuss what, if anything, can be gained from going on a kind of revenge quest, right? That there should be somebody in that camp in Jackson saying, Ellie, there's nothing to be gained from this. This will leave you hollow. Let's go watch some of those 80s action movies that you referenced as having watched with Joel and see what kind of messages they have about vengeance. Let's go watch really anything with Charles Bronson in it ever. Let's really go watch half of what was released in 80s action movies and 90s action movies and anywhere else about how hollow that is, how you can't get justice that way, how it doesn't work. And yes, I know one of the things that people might say is, hey, this is the Last of Us world. And things have gone crazy. This is people depending on themselves. There aren't police forces. There aren't armies. There aren't nations. There aren't governments. So you can't rely on a justice system. And you have to go and make justice for yourself. But I think you can see in this game, and it is a little bipolar, as we talked about, that the notion of vengeance is not a good one. The concept of violence in the face of violence, creating more violence, is basically what the game's about, although it kind of meanders and doesn't really pick a lane on what it wants to talk about with respect to that message. But one of the main issues I have is that you have this opening, you have this really interesting start to everything, you have a first sequence where you actually play as Abby and you go, uh-oh, what's up about this? And then you see what Abby is in relation to all of this, and it all kind of doesn't work on anything but a superficial level. You haven't been with Ellie for the last 4 years. There's a 4-year time jump between the end of the first game and the start of this game. You haven't been with her for the last 4 years. You don't know what her relationship to Joel is. You kind of start in media res. So they start you out with, oh, a whole lot of stuff happened last night. You can read Ellie's journal and find out a little bit more detail about that. But a whole lot of stuff happened last night. We've been estranged from Joel for some time. People are worried about it, but we're thinking about going and watching movies with him tonight, so maybe it's not that bad. But you don't get all of that detail, and immediately my narrative red flags go up and say, okay, they're going to give us that detail later when it can be most effective. One might argue most cloying or most superficial, and I think you could argue that pretty successfully for where this pops up in the narrative. But overall, Ellie going on this vengeance quest, she isn't stopped by Dina, her new girlfriend. She isn't stopped by Jesse, the kind of leader of the kids' posses in Jackson. She isn't stopped by Maria, Tommy's wife, who we met in the first game. She isn't stopped by anybody. And they give a little bit of artificial pressure to say you shouldn't do this, but not for the reasons that we might think of notionally as why you don't just go murder people, why you don't move 3 states away to go kill hundreds of people that you don't know to try to attack someone that did this bad thing to you. And yes, overall, the main conceit of the game about halfway through is that Abby was in fact having her own act of vengeance to act against Joel, who killed her father. And wow, what a cycle of violence this is. Except that's a totally superficial kind of notion. It's the kind of notion that you get in the very first scene of Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill, where the bride kills one of the people she's after and her daughter shows up and she says, hey, you know what? When you grow up, if this still bothers you, I understand and we can handle it then. That the cycle of violence is something that all of these folks should understand. And this isn't 2 years after Outbreak. This is something like 26 or 25 years after Outbreak, where you already have these kind of civilizations, these cities, these popular groups living together, doing things, including gangs in various places across the country. And instead of anybody saying this is a bad idea, instead of anybody saying, hey, this could be revisited on us, they just say, yeah, all right, go with Dina. Tommy already left, and we'll get to it. And that's just kind of the start of really the bad ideas, the dumb choices that a lot of these characters make. And unfortunately, it's those dumb choices that really motivate the action throughout the video game. It's the kind of thing that really has always bothered me. If you were familiar with the show Lost, and we will come back to that as well, one of the things that always bugged me is that people acting dumb was the primary motivation of the plots very, very often. People acting dumb, not talking about their significant other with what they just saw, not talking about what they could be doing to escape from the island, all these various things. And this is not the only show that is guilty of these things, so I don't mean to suggest that it is. But when you start talking about a narrative that you can really understand, that you can grapple with, that you can empathize with, you have to have some ability, even when people are acting irrationally, to explain their situation, to explain what is going on. And I think ultimately what this game relied upon was that you played as Joel. You say, hey, you can't do that to the guy I played as. You say, yeah, Ellie, go get him. Except one of these simplistically profound statements that the game wants to impart on you is that those people that you want to go murder, those people are people too. That group that you were otherwise fighting in the streets against, that group is made up of people too. And I look at this, and maybe I'm older than their target audience base. Maybe I've just seen a little bit more. Maybe I'm not their demographic for the sales of this game. But I look at that message, and I say, yeah, of course, duh, right? I mean, when we talk about these kinds of things, we don't say, you are murdering this person, and they are a monster, they are an animal. You do that, you other people, because you need to get there. You need to punch people in the streets. You need to do whatever it is that you want to do to them. But we don't honestly think that. We understand at our core that this person is a human being that had friends, that had family, that did whatever it is that they were going to do. And so when you spend half of your game to say, oh, you were hunting these people down, but did you know these people had feelings? You say, yes, Naughty Dog. Yes, I did know that they had feelings because they are human beings. And so I didn't need to see 11 hours of nothingness. Well, Abby was doing some other stuff while you were doing that hunting people down to understand that Abby was a person. And when you spend half of that game saying, oh, look, Abby takes care of Manny's old man. Oh, Abby loves dogs. Oh, Abby is helping kids. Isn't she such a wonderful person? Don't you think you should empathize with her? I say no. People are their actions. And yes, people can be good, people can be bad, but she obsessed for 4 years over murdering someone. And yeah, Ellie is bad. And we're going to talk about Ellie because at the end of the day, I don't like any of these characters. But Ellie is bad, but at least she is interested in getting Joel's murderer within 2 weeks of the murder and not 4 years afterwards. And maybe Naughty Dog's trying to say something profound about loss. Maybe they're trying to say something prolonged or profound about post-traumatic stress disorder. I can't tell you because the thinking there is so muddled that they don't fully explain it for themselves. But overall, Abby does a lot of bad things, does a few good things, and they want us to empathize with her. And I do empathize with her as a human being, just like I empathize with literally everybody else in this game. And unfortunately, what Naughty Dog has built here is a murder simulator. So you are killing hundreds of people. And then to tell a story about the damage, the violence that violence does upon your soul is so incredibly odd and out of touch with the actual gameplay that they have made. And it creates all of these situations when you're watching a cutscene throughout. It's not just Ellie, it's also Abby, it's also everybody else, where you have this massive dissonance between what they are doing over here and what they are saying and what they are feeling over here. And it really comes to a head as you get into the end hours of the video game, where you're just like, what are you even talking about? And how can you make all these stupid decisions? So, the baseline game here is that Ellie finds out that Joel is murdered. She goes to Seattle, and the entire game, with caveats, is played over the course of 3 days in Seattle. Ellie goes, she gets to the gates. She has a wonderful sequence in downtown Seattle, which is, in fairness, a copy over the sequence in Lost Legacy, where those two characters went around a big plain area and found a whole bunch of points of interest and did various puzzles. In this case, you ride a horse around downtown Seattle, you find points of interest, you do various things in terms of environmental puzzles, and it was great, but it's never to be visited again in the video game, which is interesting. It's remarkable. They just didn't want to tell that story, or didn't want to tell it that way, I suppose, but the rest of the game is very linear. It's big, it's open areas, but as we talked about, that doesn't really serve the gameplay very well. But they go through downtown Seattle, they get caught, they escape a high school, they go to a TV station. Now, this is the first thing that I want to say in terms of the repetition in this video game. So, one of the things that Naughty Dog has long done is they put a big thing out in the distance, what the Disney World folks might call a weenie, like the Epcot Ball or the Princess Castle. And they put it out in the distance and they say, you are trying to make that thing closer. You're trying to get there. And we're going to run these various levels, and every time that it swings back into view, it will be closer because of the magic of skyboxes, even though it doesn't feel like you walk that far. And we're going to do that. I have to say, in the rest of their games, I feel like it was done more organically. I didn't really feel like they did it as often as they did in this game. If you actually go and you actually look at the list here, and this is skipping some of them because I can't even remember them all. You go and you look at a TV station and you get to it. You go and you look to a smoke column and a hospital and a Ferris wheel and an apartment complex and the Ferris wheel, the same Ferris wheel again, and a giant tall building, and the hospital again, and the Space Needle, etc., etc., etc. Big round building. The entirety of the game is premised around, we're going to put this thing out there, you're going to fight through some malls, you're going to see some stuff, we're going to introduce maybe a new enemy, even though it's an old enemy, and you're going to fight them, and you're going to have conversations along the way, and we're going to do it, and we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it again. Now, in my opinion, you are probably already feeling that repetition by the time that Ellie gets to day 3. You would have gone after the TV station. You would have gone after the smoke column, the hospital, the Ferris wheel. You would have done all those things as Ellie, accomplishing basically nothing. You haven't been able to find Abby. It's only in day 3 when somebody tells you where Abby might be. As it turns out, she isn't. And you don't accomplish anything throughout all of that. Maybe you learn a little bit more about Ellie, or you learn a little bit more about the characters that accompany her, but you basically don't accomplish anything. And if you are feeling repetition there, get ready, because what winds up happening at that point in time is that Abby storms into your base at the theater in downtown Seattle and says, "What have you done? You've killed all my friends," holds Ellie up at gunpoint, and cut to black. Whereupon you are introduced to I think it's 4 years ago, flashback with Abby and her dad, where we are told that Abby is just such a nice person. She collects coins. She helps fix hurt zebra. She goes in to talk to her dad and says, "I'd want you to kill me if I were immune," and is basically just the best person ever. And if this feels artificial to you in the moment, you really haven't seen anything yet, because the next 10 or so hours of the video game is not just little foreshadowing with Abby, little flashbacks, whatever it might be. No, the next 4 hours, or the next 10 hours, is Abby going through day 1, day 2, and day 3 of Seattle for almost the same length of time that the gameplay of Ellie took it to take. And I think one of the things you note when you start this Abby sequence, or at least I noted, was you go into the menus and it's like, oh, those menus look pretty fulsome. Because one of the things that they introduced in this game is a new way of using your supplements, so that you essentially go and you find training manuals and you unlock these various different kind of supplement skill chains. And you see that it's locked, just like it was with Ellie. and then you get one training manual and it only unlocks another one that is also locked, and you say, uh-oh. And so you get this impression that they're going to do this full game service with Abby, and indeed they do. And I sit back and I say, well, okay, you can absolutely do a kind of, this is a different perspective, and that can be very interesting. But one of the things that really needs to happen when you're going to give that different perspective is that you are going to have to tell a story that relates in some fashion to the first story that you were telling, right? The first 3 days in Seattle are Ellie getting there, Ellie wanting to hunt down Joel's murderer, Ellie hunting down all these various people of the Washington Liberation Front, the so-called wolves, and how they are interacting as she is apparently just on Abby's heels in various numbers of these locations. And so I go, okay, well, you could tell an interesting story that way. There'd maybe Abby interacting, maybe Abby is actually hunting Ellie for a portion of this. You can have interesting things to say, except what Abby's day 1, day 2, and day 3 actually are is Abby was off doing some other stuff. And that isn't a good way to tell a story. And as a matter of fact, where they decided to cut off Ellie's story is also a part of the problems with the pacing of this video game, because they cut off Ellie's story with Abby holding her up at gunpoint. And you think about this structure and you say, okay, well, if you're going to build this structure, then you have those 3 days with Ellie, you have those 3 days with Abby. Something happens at that point in time. Maybe they have to get together. Maybe they have to work together against a common enemy, whatever it might be. Could be trite, could be tropey, but that the period of time after that, after holding her up at gunpoint, has to be something significant in order to make the whole structure make sense, because otherwise you are just cutting off the ending in order to sell me some other different show. I talked about Lost earlier, but this is one of those things that happened in that show. It also happened in a show that you might be more familiar with, since Lost is a little bit older now, called Stranger Things on Netflix, where you have all of this kind of excitement, all of these inciting events, and then you just cut it off to do something else. In Lost, they did a whole big flashback about the nature of the island after all this stuff had gone down, I think 2 or 3 episodes before the finale. In Stranger Things, you had all this action in the second season of that show, and then it just kind of went into a side story where Eleven was off with some friends in a different city, and then it went right back to the story afterwards. And unfortunately, that's what this entire interlude with Abby winds up feeling like. Yes, you get the understanding that Naughty Dog wants you to know that she is a person. She has all these difficulties. She has Owen, her ex-boyfriend, who has actually impregnated his current girlfriend, and she doesn't like that, and they have some estrangement issues there. You have all of these interactions with her crew, with her people, that you watch get wiped out by Tommy and Ellie, and you see Abby's reactions to all these various things, but it doesn't actually tell you anything. All you know is that Abby is apparently a good person for these 3 days. She goes and she helps kids. She does various things to make herself feel better, apparently, after torturing and murdering Joel. But you don't actually get any extra insight as to who she was, who she is, and certainly who she is going to be. So instead of having this kind of profound effect of, oh, this is the same story from a different perspective, I understand it better, you get this kind of side quest-a-palooza, right? If you're familiar with RPGs, you know you can have the main quest that advances the ball, and you can do all these side quests. And a lot of the times in JRPGs, the side quests are the better content. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Abby's content might not have been better or felt better to me if it wasn't presented as this 10-hour roadblock to finding out exactly what happens when Abby and Ellie finally confront each other. But because it was positioned as that, it wasn't good. It just kind of felt like they were dragging their feet. And frankly, Abby's problems are not that interesting. The basic premise of Abby's story is that she is a member of the Wolves. She is going to go find Owen, her ex-boyfriend, who apparently shot one of his patrol teammates in defense of the Scars. And I suppose we should talk about them in a second as well, so we shall. But he apparently did that. The mortal enemies of the Wolves, he defended and he killed his partner. And so Abby decides to go AWOL, which will have its own negative ramifications for her story, and go after Owen, only to find out that there are a couple of kid Scars that she herself winds up wanting to help. And I think the notion here thematically is that going to Jackson, torturing and killing Joel has changed. Owen has changed. Abby has changed. Mel, which is Owen's impregnated girlfriend and former friend, presumably, of Abby, because this entire crew of people that we meet and that we kill, frankly, in this video game are from Salt Lake City. They're all the kids or otherwise related to the people that Joel murdered at the hospital at the end of part 1. And so they are all becoming more and more estranged over these 3 days when they are back in Seattle. And it's an interesting theme. Vengeance changes you, torture changes you, murder changes you, except these people are in the business of killing other people. And it's unclear about the message because basically what you see happen with Owen and Abby and maybe even Mel is that after they came back, they were better people. Owen doesn't want to murder scars anymore, so he actually kills his partner in order to defend them. Abby has a dream about the kids that helped her hanging in a tree, and so she goes and helps them. Now, the only actual discussion we have about these plot points is why did they happen? I just had to. I was guilty. It was something I had to do. These kinds of things. And it's an odd message for this particular game because it seems to suggest that Abby is better for having murdered Joel. Everybody is better for having gone through this entire process. And I don't think that's the message that the game intends, but it's so muddled on all these points and is so focused on getting you to sympathize with Abby that it just kind of drops the ball on all of this stuff. So if you're following along, now we have a video game where you have a 10-hour interlude designed to tell you something that you already know, that presents it to you condescendingly and over and over and over again with high levels of repetition. And when you finally get to the point where Abby confronts Ellie, it's over in 10 minutes. Tommy jumps her, people get shot, arrows are exchanged, people are threatened, and then you, as Abby, have to attack Ellie. And Abby gets the better of Ellie, and then the person that she's with, Lev, the Scar child, who she has fought with and whose sister has died, and all these various things that happened during the video game, essentially looks at her and says, no, don't kill Dina, who is also pregnant. Don't kill Ellie. Let's just get out of here. And the story told to that point is essentially Abby saying, yeah, all right, let's go. And it doesn't make any sense for anybody's character motivations, right? I made a list here of the various dumb choices that I saw. And I want to go over them with you because I think these are only the dumb choices that relate to actually progressing the plot, right? There are a lot of dumb choices. There are a lot of dumb things that happen between, say, Jesse and Dina or these various things that I don't care about so much. A lot of this is written, I say it as a CW show, not as a disparagement really, but in that kind of soapy teen drama, young adult literature kind of fashion, but also with the backstop of grotesque, violent murdering. And so these are the choices that I saw that really created a problem. So Isaac, the leader of the Wolves, lets the Salt Lake posse go to Jackson while wearing wolf patches on their jackets, which is the only way that the Jackson crew actually find them, or at least find them as fast as they do. Abby then is obsessing for years after her dad is killed to go and murder Joel, and the notions of justice that her entire group and apparently Isaac at the Wolves believe will be aided by this murder, by going to Jackson and murdering and torturing Joel. Then the crew, having tortured Joel, with Ellie and Joel's brother Tommy in the room, have a fight and decide not to kill Ellie and Tommy, because they would be no better than Joel if that were the case. Now, in actuality, that conversation is muted out when you first hear it from Ellie, and if you are familiar with movies or television or have ever read a book, you understand that this conceit, oh, I was knocked out, oh, there's ringing in my ears, and there's this big conversation happening, you understand that that is going to swing back around, right? So if you're following all of these plot points, you already know the fact that Ellie and Tommy are alive after that confrontation means that Abby's crew are not the indiscriminate murderers that you might otherwise think that they are. Ellie should know this. Tommy should know this. Joel made a lot of enemies. That doesn't make it right. But you also have to evaluate the cost-benefit analysis here, and there are losses galore on all these fronts. One of the things I half expected to happen as a part of this game, because it was so grimdark, because it was so negative, was actually a kind of scouring of the Shire, right? Maria winds up letting all of these people go, all of her best fighters, because she doesn't want to put together a fighting group. She needs to defend Jackson. But instead, Tommy gets out. Ellie gets out. Dina gets out. Jesse gets out. She loses all of these main players in defending her city, and I half expected you would kill Abby or not kill Abby, and you would come home and Jackson would be on fire because you going and seeking personal vengeance wound up killing everything that you loved. Now, the story is somewhat like that. That's where you get to with Ellie, at least by the end of the game. But that's what I thought was going to happen, because the next thing that occurs is after Abby leaves Ellie and Tommy alive, Ellie decides that she needs to go seek revenge, and Maria fails her city completely by not creating a posse, right? So Isaac let all his people out, presumably because part of that story is that they wouldn't say no. They wouldn't take no for an answer. He needs Abby. She's one of his best fighters. And so he says, yeah, go get him and then come back. That's justice, whatever. Maria says, no, we can't do that. We can't spare the troops. And so instead, she lets everybody go piecemeal. Tommy's by himself. Ellie and Dina are by themselves. Jesse is by himself. And it's just the worst possible thing that could happen. Then you have all these interactions in the middle of the game. Ellie decides to go alone to the hospital instead of waiting for any period of time that would make more sense. And after finding out that Dina is pregnant, right? So Dina is pregnant. You say, oh, well, we can't go back now. Why not? Where do you think Abby is going to go? Why can't you go back? You have a pregnant woman with you on the mission. And then when Jesse confronts her about it later, she says, well, we have to go get Tommy. Tommy is here because of me, which Jesse says, yeah, okay. What? What are you talking about? Tommy left before you. Jesse knows that Tommy left before you, presumably. And yes, you're lying to Jesse because you have no intention of going to get Tommy if you otherwise have a beat on Abby. But why does Jesse take that? And on that walk with Jesse, Jesse says, hey, have you ever thought about the fact that if you murder them, they're going to come back and murder us, and this is just going to keep on continuing, and this is history throughout human events, and maybe we shouldn't do this because there's nothing really to be gained here? And she says, yeah, nah, it's fine. One of the main pieces of dialogue that Ellie has is with whoever she's walking with being told a new bit of information about Abby, about the wolves, about anything else, and then them saying to Ellie, does this change anything for you? And Ellie's like, nah, still got to kill her. Still got to hunt her down. I am so focused. I am so driven by this goal that I traveled from multiple states to go get this woman. And what happens at the end? Well, we'll get there. So Ellie goes alone to the hospital. She then beats Nora up at the hospital and apparently gets information that Abby is at the aquarium because, as we'll find out later in the game, that's basically where Nora thinks she is, except there's no reason in that situation for Nora to give accurate information. This is one of the kind of Jack Bauer 24 problems with torture on a time frame. Right? She has already ingested spores. She doesn't want to be in pain, but virtually any bit of information that you give Ellie cannot be verified in the moment. Right? She doesn't have the kind of thing that she wants to do where you have somebody point at a map and the other person confirm it and all this kind of stuff. She doesn't have that with Nora in the moment. So from both a kind of contextual perspective and also an in-person perspective, why does Ellie think Nora is telling the truth right there? If I were Nora in that situation and this person has chased me down, is beating me, clearly doesn't care, is hunting down my friends, I find the place. She's on Scar Island. It's where we hide out. So go get her, right? Go pick some place that's impossible to get to that will likely kill Ellie. Don't say the aquarium. And instead, she does say the aquarium. It is roughly the right place for Ellie to be. Mel and Owen wind up getting murdered because Ellie shows up there. And why would anyone expect Nora to have told anything remotely resembling the truth? So that's a bad choice, even though it's the kind of thing that a writer likes to do. We already talked about Ellie not sending Jesse and Dina back, Ellie ignoring Jesse's discussion of revenge causing more revenge, Ellie deciding to go after Abby when she and Jesse are together because Jesse wants to go help Tommy, and Ellie doesn't care at that point. I'm sorry, what? Ellie's been living with Joel and Tommy for 4 years. Presumably her revenge quest, her focus is based around the fact that these people murdered Joel and she doesn't care if they murder Tommy. I understand that Joel is a closer person to her, but what exactly is this woman's motivations at this point in time? Right? She's just a bad person seeking bad ends for no apparent reason and somebody that should be better than this. And yeah, it's okay. You can tell a story about someone that should be better and isn't. But you also have to give the reasons for why they aren't. You have to give a discussion about what it is that has made them the way they are. And what Naughty Dog tries to do here is they try to give you that backing at the very end. And one of the things I said to my wife after Joel got murdered and Ellie started talking about the fact that she couldn't believe the last thing that she said to him is I said, well, so the way this is structured, we are going to get that conversation. We are going to get that conversation probably very close to the end. And as a matter of fact, it turns out to be the exact ending of the game in which you find out that after all these flashbacks, after all of this kind of time frame jumbling, that Ellie had told Joel that she couldn't forgive him for the hospital massacre, for taking away her meaning of life, but that she wanted to try. That night was the night that Ellie decided that she was going to try to reconcile with Joel, and basically the next day that was taken away. Now, that's all well and good. It's a pretty common conceit in media to kind of go back and say, oh, this was the conversation they had right before everything that you saw, except it's cheating, right? Throughout the entirety of the game, you don't even know that Ellie had that conversation. You don't know exactly what is driving her to all of this. So you can't step into her shoes, and it doesn't functionally change anything at the end. So it's neither profound nor twists nor really that interesting other than to say, okay, so Ellie has a little bit of extra motivation over just Joel was my surrogate father figure. But she doesn't go after Tommy. She doesn't go to help Jesse. She doesn't really care about any of these people. She's just driven by what amounts to madness, and that's always going to be a very hard thing for someone to grapple with. Next, you have Tommy and Jesse leaving the map to the theater at the place where Ellie murders Mel and Owen. Now, understand the oversight here. Ellie has that map. They know that Abby is still out there. They know that Abby was supposed to be at the aquarium. And they didn't even check the scene to get rid of any indication of where they are or where they're from or where they're located in the city. They leave a map with their location circled on it. Yeah, I understand the need for plot contrivance. I understand the need for Ellie and her team are going to leave the city the next day, so you need Abby to be able to get there fast. But that is absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Next, you have on Abby's side of the equation, you have Abby originally deciding to go after Owen, despite needing to go AWOL. You have Abby deciding to help the Scar kids for no other reason that we can see other than the fact that she has a dream about them hanging in a tree. And we don't get a good enough insight as to Abby, who is referred to as Isaac's Scar Killer, coming back and changing her operational mindset so completely that she now devotes her life to protecting these Scar kids, or at least the one that she can protect through the end of the video game. And we don't get to go on that journey with her. We aren't told that story. It's just, she came back, she murdered Joel, and then she just didn't want to do this anymore. Which sounds, as I talked about before, very much like someone that says, yeah, you know, I got my vengeance out and I feel like a better person now. I feel more full, and we're going to roll now. But I can't imagine that's what the game wants you to think about this particular situation. And yet, there it is, because after she helps the Scar kids, after she goes on yet another hospital quest to cut off an arm for a person that isn't even going to survive the day, she comes back and she lets Ellie and Dina go. She lets Ellie and Dina go for no reason other than the fact that Lev, the Scar kid that she is with, nodding at her, saying, no, don't do this. This is a person that she met within the last 48 hours when she has the opportunity to kill, for vengeance or otherwise, the people responsible for murdering the person that she randomly had sex with 36 hours ago, and she decides not to do it, even though she is the same person that 2 weeks ago fulfilled her obsession of 4 years by murdering and torturing Joel with a golf club. This isn't the way people are. And if it is the way people are, we get told a better story, but how their brain got there. And we weren't told that story. And again, I understand video game reviewers, I understand people that might be watching this video not wanting to dive into these things. Narrative, character, all these things aren't really usually what you have to be thinking about with respect to video games, but that's what Naughty Dog wants to do. They didn't add very much to the gameplay. They have great art, they have great graphics, but they want to tell this story, and this story falls apart on 56 different dimensions. Abby lets Ellie and Dina go, despite them being an active threat to her, despite them having murdered her friends, her sex partner, the people that she knows, Tommy murdering them, and she knows Tommy is there, right? She just threw Tommy into the ocean the day before. She knows Tommy is with this crew. She knows that he killed Manny. She knows all of these things. She doesn't extract any vengeance there. She doesn't. She lets them go, even though she knows that they spent 2 weeks and crossed multiple states to come find her, and that they represent this continuing and active threat. Now, there might have been a way to tell this story. There might have been a way to show this evolution, this growth in the character of Abby. But whatever they did here didn't accomplish it. And I would love for them to have accomplished it. I wanted to love this. I did. I love The Last of Us. But I don't love The Last of Us Part 2. Abby lets them go. And then we get what amounts to an epilogue type scene. We get Dina and Ellie on the farmhouse, happy, putting sheep into a barn, having a little baby to talk over, right? We have all this stuff. And then essentially we have Ellie with post-traumatic stress disorder, and we have Tommy show up with a map to where he thinks that Abby will be. And Ellie says, I can't stay here. I have to go do it. At which point, you put the controller down and you say, what is the point of any of this? Right? If you were supposed to learn something in Seattle, if you were supposed to learn that violence begets violence, that this is a cycle, that everybody on the other side is a person too, that you come out of the theater and you say, I understand why you killed Joel. It's my fault. Take me. That's your mindset at that point in time. Just because Tommy fights a gun away and then Abby doesn't kill you, how do you get back to the place as Ellie where you have to go to California by yourself and give up your family, give up your house, give up the life that Joel would have wanted you to have? I don't know the answer to that question, because the rest of the game in California is Ellie killing all of these random people in a gang in Santa Barbara, getting to Abby, taking her down from some pillars that are torture devices on the beach, having a fight where she can drown Abby, and then seeing Joel's face and deciding not to do so. This is absolutely ludicrous character motivation. You have Abby changing her mind every scene. You have Ellie changing her mind every scene. You have Tommy changing his mind every scene. Tommy, before he sends her after Abby, is in the theater saying, yeah, she gets away with it. And then they find her in California, and he's the one that puts all the guilt and pressure on Ellie to go after her. None of this makes any sense. And at the end of the day, you get to the credits and you're like, what were you even trying to say? Because I don't know. You've got various kind of references to Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now and a lot of red lights in various places. If you see the color red while you're playing this game, know that there's some psychological turmoil or just big nasties that are going to come after you. Speaking of which, there's a place in the game where you fight the monster from the end of Limbo that is hilarious, but not really all that threatening. Some of the encounter design is not great. You can run out of bullets in the midst of a locked room, and you have to wind up really resetting the whole encounter. At least I did. Maybe you're better than me at this. But you do fight funny things like the Limbo monster. But narratively speaking, you don't get to a place that makes any sense. Ellie chases after her once, fails. Chases after her again, refuses. And then you get to the end, she's lost everything. She's lost her family. She's lost Dina. She's lost JJ. The farmhouse is empty. She plays a little bit of guitar. She sees Joel playing guitar. You get the conversation that they had, and she walks away, cut to credits. And like, what did I even play? Even if I had only played Ellie's version, even if there had only been a 10-minute flashback to establish that Abby is a human being, even if that were it was just 15, 16, 17 hours long, it wouldn't make a compelling story. It wouldn't be something that you would want to revisit. The Last of Us Part 1 was lyrical. It was about the end of the world. It was about being the Last of Us. What choices you make in the face of the possibility of saving the human race, and how the impact of the past, Joel losing his daughter, played upon him so much that when he finally once again bonded with a teenage girl, he couldn't abide saving humanity to see her go. and Ellie dealing with that. The ending of The Last of Us Part 1 is brilliant because you get to the end and Joel tells her a lie. And Ellie says, okay, with the understanding in her eyes, because they really are good at motion capture over at Naughty Dog, that she understands it's a lie, but it's a lie that saves both of them. Saves them both to move on, to press on, to live lives, and to experience life in the way that hopefully they would get a chance to. And maybe they did for 4 or so years. But The Last of Us Part 2 not only strips that away, it makes Ellie into a character that is just one of the worst in video gaming history. Now, you can separate these things. Headcanon is a real thing. You don't have to accept The Last of Us Part 2 as the continuation of Joel and Ellie's story. I probably won't when I reflect on the original Last of Us. But Naughty Dog came into this game with the notion of telling you something about vengeance, telling you something about what it means to seek that vengeance, to perpetuate the cycle of violence. And unfortunately, they only told you simple things. It's kind of bad. It results in a lot of people dying. But otherwise, we don't have anything profound to say. But we're going to present it as profoundly as possible and really make you think that we're really presenting you with some artistry. And we're also going to do that in such a fashion that it's going to feel brutally slow over the second half of the video game, which comes back to some of the reviews, right? If you read any of these, you know one of the things that was referenced in these reviews was the fact that Sony had put on a very, very, very heavy embargo. That if you got an early release copy of this game and you went to review it, you weren't allowed to talk about the back half. The last 12 hours, I think, is actually how it was described. And nobody really understood why. Now we understand why, because that's Abby's half and nothing really happens. I don't mind not playing as Ellie. I thought it was brilliant when you were playing the first game to get to play as Ellie in the winter season and not in the rest of the time, and I thought that was a really nice change of pace. I don't mind playing as Abby. Abby has some nice gameplay stuff, has some interesting things that differentiate her from Ellie, but the overall story just is absolutely treading water. She goes to Owen, she goes to the aquarium, she gets some flashbacks, she helps some scars. You get some great stuff with an attack from the wolves on Scar Island. You get some just ridiculous looking fire. You have a great horse chase scene. There's a lot of great chases in this game. The Naughty Dog crew really loves their zombie hordes, really loves locomotion, really loves horses and cars. And they do a great job with it. It's a lot of fun. It's very visceral, but it's like 2 minutes out of 27 hours of video game. And so I think when you start talking about what all this is, you've got a real issue with the pace of the whole thing. It's not structured the way it should have been. And I was thinking about this while I was playing it. And I was thinking about it while I was prepping for this review Postmortem. And I think, and maybe this was the way it was designed, I think it would have made more sense to be something like a Resident Evil 2 type bifurcated campaign. Or if you're familiar with real-time strategy, something like a Warcraft. Now, that plays in order. But if you're going to do a simultaneous campaign, you could absolutely do it. You could have something called Ellie, to the very end, or Ellie Vengeance, or whatever it might be. And you could have a campaign menu that gets you through the intro, and then you choose between playing as Abby and something called, A Scarred Life, or Living with the Scars, and something like that, and Ellie, and you could choose what order it's in, and you could get to some point, you'd have to clean up the ending of the campaign a little bit, you get to some point where it feels like something like a finale for either of the characters. And then you get to a third secret campaign that opens up once you have seen both sides of that. Or you just go all the way through with Ellie, and then a secret campaign opens up that lets you see the other side of the story. And I think if you present it either way like that, I think you'd get a lot more kudos. Now, it doesn't matter because you have all these reviews, right? What Rick is saying here in the Postmortem doesn't actually matter to you if you're Naughty Dog, because you got all the reviews that you wanted. You're going to make all the sales that you want, except I do think that sales, I do think that critical acclaim, these follow on the tail of their predecessor. So Last of Us Part 2 was always going to get the benefit of the doubt because of how great Last of Us Part 1 was. I think as people think about this game, as we continue to kind of metabolize what happened in it, what narrative beats occurred, why it worked or didn't work for each of us, I think what's going to happen is this is going to sour in a lot of people's minds. And certainly when we talk about the prettiest game ever made, and I think it is, that medal, that award, that title is given to a new game every year, right? Cyberpunk 2077 this year might be the prettiest game of all time before the year ends. We don't know. But The Last of Us Part 2 won't be the prettiest game of all time for more than a couple of years. And so when that fades away, when it's just a game, and we look back at what it is. It's not lyrical. It doesn't tell this interesting story about a post-apocalyptic world. In fact, it tells a not interesting story of a kind of Charles Bronson-esque death wish nature in a world that just happens to have fungi zombies. Then what are we going to be left with? We're going to be left with a fairly hollow game that tells fairly facile or superficial things to us, and all the while condescends to us that it is telling us very important things that we need to take in and be aware of because it's so very, very important. So I think they could have gone a different direction. I think they could have organized into separate campaigns. I think they could have fixed this pacing issue. But overall, I think the overall concept was not one that was very smart. I think The Last of Us Part 2 should have been focused on the nature of the world, on what it meant to be The Last of Us and not just Ellie on a revenge quest. I think it takes a lot of chutzpah, but I don't think it is smart to make the overall inciting event of the game, the fact that Joel murdered all these people in the hospital, something that people were already arguing with or upset about as dissonant to what they wanted to accomplish in The Last of Us. So you get into this kind of Bioshock type discussion of, oh, well, the game is chiding you for doing these very bad things, except that it forced you to do them. You know, if you sit in the hospital room as Joel, eventually the Fireflies come in and kill you. You can't advance the game by not murdering everybody at the end of the first game. And so you have that moment where you are Joel, you are doing these things. And I remember playing this and saying, I don't want to be doing these things. Ellie wanted to sacrifice herself. This is not informed consent. She should be allowed to do that. Now, ideally, I think she should wake up, she should be told the situation, and then she should do it. But she would want to, as was indicated in all these rest of these scenes in Part 2, all the scenes that you actually had with her in Part 1. It can't all be for nothing, Ellie's refrain. And you get to that point in time, and Joel is doing something wrong, but it wasn't up to you. And then to have all of this vengeance wreaked upon you, have all these bad things happen to you because you were forced to do what Naughty Dog wanted you to do 7 years ago, it feels like stealing a base a little bit. So, in broad strokes, that's what I have for you. That's my post-mortem analysis of The Last of Us Part 2. I wish I was more enamored with this game than I am. If you are at all interested in this, and you are still interested in it after this post-mortem, I do recommend trying it out. There's a lot of good stuff there. There's certainly a lot of good things with procedural animations. There's a lot of good things with kind of stringing those animations together, the graphics, the detail, a lot of good stuff. But overall, it's meandering, it's pointless, and I really do wish I liked it a lot better than I do.